So after we discussing the Starbucks, the size of coffee shop example, we understand the importance of the regression analysis. So the most important reason we are learning the regression model is because we want to use the regression model to help us to do the forecasting, prediction, and so that can better the decision-making process. And so for this, in this part of the video, we're actually going to talk about the limitation of the model and some important knowledge you have to know before we look at the regression model itself. So first of all, I want to refresh your memory about the four scale of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And I highlight the last two, interval and ratio scale measurement, because they are the only two scale measurement you can use to measure the quantitative data. So there is a one limit of the model we are learning in this class, the regression analysis. So the variable we try to predict, like the size of coffee shop, it has to be able to use a quantitative variable to measure it. So that's why if you try to recall what I said about your group project topic, and I said that when you work on your group project topic, you have to be able to find the quantitative data to measure your topic. So for instance, the price of a cereal, and then the student's GPA. So you will notice that all those variables are quantitative variables. So the reason we have that limitation requirement is because of the limitation of the model we are learning. And so this is very important, you have to keep in mind. And the second, and you have to remember what you learned before in your geometry class. So you understand in your geometry class, you know every line, a straight line, just what you're seeing on these slides, a vertical upward blue line. So you always can find a unique equation to representing this line. So for example, in this case, the vertical axis is y variable and horizontal axis is x variables. And so this upward line actually indicating relationship between x and y. So corresponding to this straight line, you will find this equation y equal to mx plus b. So in this equation, you can see the variable y and the variable x, and also you have two parameters b and m. So the b is called the y-intercept. So why we call it y-intercept? Because when x equal to 0, y's value equal to b. If you try to find this on the diagram, you will notice that when x equal to 0, it will back to the origin, and the y's value is b. So that is literally the intersection between this line and the y-axis. So that's why we call the b as the y-intercept. And the m is called the slope, and the slope is measuring if x change and how y will change. To be more specific, so if x increase, so x always be the one to move first. So if x increase by 1 unit, and y actually gonna changing by m unit. So that is the slope. And so we're gonna see this similar expression when we look at the simple linear regression model. And next, we're gonna discuss, I will introduce the very important component for the regression model. And so that is my variables you're going to see in the regression model. And so the first variable you would see in the regression model is called the y variable. So y variable. So that is the variable being predicted. It's called the dependent variable, and it is denoted by y. And so if we look at a coffee shop case, so let's look at this coffee shop case. So we will look at what will affect the size of coffee shop. We have the size of coffee shop, budget, and the potential customer, and availability of the space. So now the question here is, so which is the variable we try to predict? So if you look at the definition of the dependent variable, that is a variable being predicted. It is called dependent, and also is y variable. So now if you look at this question, what will affect the size of coffee shop? And we'll look at how the budget, maybe the budget, potential customer, availability of the space. Are we predicting the budget? No. Potential customer? No. So what we try to predicting is the size of the coffee shop. So that's why the size of the coffee shop will become your y variable. And so it is also our dependent and and also predicted variable. So that's why the size of the coffee shop will be our dependent variable, and also y variable or predicted variable. So because this is variable, we try to predict what will affect the size of coffee shop. So after we know one of the first very important component in your regression model, we're going to look at the second one. So for the second important component of the regression model, you will see is called the independent variable, and also we use x to denote it. So that is a variable being used to predict the value of the dependent variable. That is called independent variable. So that is called independent variable. And so if we look at the coffee shop case again, so we identify that the size of coffee shop is y because we try to predict what's the size going to be my coffee shop if I want to run coffee shop. So then we are thinking maybe the budget, and then the potential customers, and also availability of space. So then that means all three of them. So all three of them will be my x variable and the independent variable and predicting variable. And sometimes we call it a predictor. So all three of them I listed on the paper. The budget, potential customer, availability, we're using them to predict the size of the coffee shop. Therefore, they become my x variables, and my independent variables, and my predicting variable, we also call the predictors. So here we have 3 x variables, 3 independent variables, or 3 predicting variable, or 3 predictors. So that is the 2 components you will see in the regression model we're going to see in next video. And so why we need to understand these 2 variables? Because depends on how many predictor you have, how many x variable you have, we have different kind of the regression model. So that's why when we look at the simple linear regression model, you will notice that we only have 1 independent variable and 1 dependent variable. So if we look at the size of coffee shop case, so if we try to develop the simple linear regression model, so for each model, we only can analyze 1 factor. So for instance, we look at how the budget going to affect the size of coffee shop, or we're going to look at then we can develop the second simple linear regression model to study how the potential customer going to affect the size of coffee shop. So this is called the simple linear regression model. So if we have more than 1 predictor, if we try to include more than 1 predictor, such as the budget, potential customer, and the availability of the space, if we try to include all 3 in 1 model, and in that case, we call the multiple regression model. So the regression analysis involves 2 or more independent variable is called multiple regression model. And so in this chapter, what we're going to focus in, chapter 14, will be simple linear regression model. So we're only discussing the model with only 1 predictor. So this is the simplest regression model you can see. So simple doesn't mean easy. So simple actually means building a good foundation for us. So that's why we actually spend more time in chapter 14. So after we understand the analysis procedure, the basic foundation, we're going to move on to chapter 15. And in chapter 15, we're going to discuss the multiple linear regression model. So that will be a relatively complicated case because we're actually going to include more, at least 2 x variable in the model. And then in chapter 16, we're going to look at more complicated situation. We're actually going to look at the nonlinear simple and nonlinear multiple regression model. So basically, after we finish learning chapter 14, 15, and 16, you will have all the knowledge about the concept listed on this flowchart and the flowchart. And so next, we're going to look at is the analysis procedure you have to go through every time you work on the regression analysis. So generally speaking, you need to go through 6 steps. 6 steps. Any regression analysis, simple, multiple, nonlinear regression model, you always have to go through 6 steps. First step, decide variable. So what is your y variable? What are your x variables? And so these steps is depends on your previous studies. So for instance, when you look at your project, and so for instance, some group try to study what is going to affect the student's GPA. So that is the project that are done by the previous semesters. So we're going to affect students' GPA. So their y variable is the variable they try to predict. So that will be the student's GPA. And then they are thinking about different kind of predictors, such as the gender, age, etc. So that will become their x variables. So the first step, always try to figure out your variables. So that's why when you work on your project, I ask you for the topic. And so when you write down your introduction, I require you to explain what are the factors you're thinking going to affect your, help you to answer, analyzing your topic. So that's the topic is get idea about your y variable. And when you write the introduction to talk about the factors, so that you let me know you understand what going to be your potential x variables. So the first step, so we won't go through we won't go talk more about this first step because we already done a study so far. And second step, descriptive statistics. So when you are doing the regression model, the second step is to using the knowledge you learn in chapter 3, numerate descriptions to generate a mean, median, mode, standard deviation for all the variable you have, not just for y variable, but for all your x variables as well. So the reason we need to list our, try to analyzing our descriptive statistics is because, first of all, we have to have a general idea about the sample we are analyzing. And second, ideally, our sample should be able to represent in the population. How are you going to prove it? Actually, the way you prove it is by showing your descriptive statistics. So for instance, you try to do a study about relative Erie County, and so one of the factors you're considering is the gender. And so let's see the racial distribution for Erie County is 40% male, 40% female, 20% try to others, including bisexual, unidentified, etc. So now you collect your data, you did your descriptive statistics, and then you notice that the female is 20%, male is 60%, and other is 20%. So if that's the case, you notice that your sample actually won't be able to represent in the population. Therefore, you actually cannot use the model you developed to predict what's going to happen in the Erie County because the sample cannot be used to represent in the population. So therefore, the second step actually pretty important before you go further to do the regression analysis. So luckily, we don't need to repeat what we already learned about descriptive statistics because we already learned in chapter 3. So if you forgot how to get descriptive statistics, make sure you go back to watch the videos regarding how to use Excel to generate descriptive statistics, including mean, median, mode, standard deviation, skewness, etc. And so this is the second step, so we won't repeat in chapter 14. And step number 3, the functional form of the regression. So usually after we get our mean, median, mode, and we're going to use in this Excel to generate the regression line, which is the regression scatter plot with a fitted line. And so the reason we try to generate this chart diagram is because, like I said, chapter 14, 15, we are learning linear regression model. So we are assuming x and y have a linear relationship. How can we prove it? So we actually have to generate this scatter diagram to show x and y truly have a linear relationship. So if you won't be able to find a linear relationship, let's say you see the curve, so what are you going to do? You're actually going to use the technique we learned in chapter 16 to do the adjustment of your data set so that your data will become the linear, will fit in the linear fitted line as again. So the step number 3 we already learned in chapter 2 when we look at the descriptive statistic, the numeric the graphical display for the relationship of two variables. We actually already learned how to generate the scatter diagram. So if you forgot, again, go back to look at the computer skill class to refresh your memory. So what we're going to focus in chapter 14 are the step number 4, obtain the regression model. So in part A, we're going to focus on 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. The optimal goal for this step number 4 is allow us to obtain a good sample model that I can use to predict the population. So 4.1 is, step 4.1, we're going to learn how to estimate the regression sample model, how to estimate the sample model after you collect the data, how you use the computer software to assist you to get the regression model. And the 4.2, after you receive your regression model using the computer software, and then you're going to use the statistic generated from the statistic software to examine if your sample model is good enough to capturing the characteristic of your sample. So if that's the case, and then we're going to move on to the 4.3, testing the quality of the population model. Because keep in mind, your ultimate goal is try to use this sample model to predict what's going to happen in the population. So if your sample model cannot be used to representing the population, how are you going to use this model to predict the population? That's why the 4.3 is very important. So you're actually going to use in the two potential methods, significant hypothesis testing or confidence interval of the slope, to test out if your sample model can be used to representing the population model. So after those 3 steps, and then if you do get a good sample model that can be used to representing the population, then we can move to step number 5. So the step number 5, we're actually going to learn in chapter 14, part B. So we're going to use the model we examined, qualified, and we're going to use the model to do the forecasting and estimation. We're going to look at how can we use that model to do the forecasting and estimation. So we're going to cover it in 14, part B. And then lastly, before we firm the model is great, and we're going to do one more check that is called the diagnostics. So the reason we're going to do the diagnostics is because the model itself have a lot of assumptions imposed. Generally speaking, we have 5 assumptions, and we're going to look at how we're going to use the method. So in this class, we're using the graphical method to examine if the assumptions still hold after we estimate our model. So that's why this is our last steps, to last final check to make sure the model is good and it can be implemented in other situations as well. So totally 6 steps. So in chapter 14, we're going to focus on 4.1, chapter 14.A, part A, we're going to focus on 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and in chapter 14, part B, we're going to focus on step number 5. So after we finish learning chapter 15, and we're going to focus on, we're going to have one special lecture just talk about diagnostics and how we're going to do the diagnostics. And so the reason we put after the chapter 15, after we finish learning the multiple linear regression model, is because the diagnostics are the same. And no matter it's a simple linear regression model or multiple linear regression model, they are the same. So that's why we wait after we finish learning chapter 15, we're going to look at the diagnostics. So this is a very important 6 step you have to bear in your mind. So for the rest of the videos, we're going to go through step by steps. And also when you look at your homework due in 2 weeks, and you're also going to notice that the question you will be asked is actually follow the 6 steps as well. Follow the 6 steps as well. And so it's very important you understand when you read the question, what kind of information you should use to answer the question. So in order to know that, first of all, you have to remember these 6 steps. And so as we move on to our step 4.1, make sure you get your Excel file ready and get your handout ready. And also make sure you get your attendance check practice question ready as well, because at the end of each steps video, and I will show you how to work on the problem set related to your attendance check. So make sure you get everything ready before you start to watch the next video.